One of the greatest misconceptions I had about Christianity was that once you came to God, life would become easier. That once you gave your life to Jesus, the battles would stop. That once you surrendered, peace would automatically follow. That was not my experience. My experience was that once I started drawing closer to God, the warfare intensified. And if I'm being completely honest, there were moments when I wondered what exactly I had signed up for. Then I started looking at David differently. Not David the king, not David the worshiper, David the warrior. And that's when things started making sense, because David's life was warfare, not occasional warfare, constant warfare. Before he became king, warfare. After he became king, warfare. Before Goliath, warfare. After Goliath, warfare. While hiding in caves, warfare. While leading men, warfare. While raising children, warfare. His life was a battlefield. And yet somehow, through all of it, he remained connected to God. That fascinated me, because by this point in my life, I was experiencing battles I could not explain. Some people may not understand what I am about to say. Others will understand it immediately. The warfare was not theoretical. It wasn't a sermon. It wasn't a Bible study. It wasn't a church discussion. It was real. It was personal. It was relentless. I was experiencing disturbing dreams, perverse dreams, attacks that seemed to come repeatedly during sleep, things I could not explain naturally, things I could not simply dismiss, things that left me waking up exhausted, confused, and searching for answers. I began realizing that there were forces contending for territory in my life, contending for influence, contending for access, contending for agreements, contending for ownership. And I was no longer willing to surrender that territory. That is where David's story became deeply personal, because David understood what it felt like to be hunted. Saul hunted him, relentlessly. David knew how to live under pressure. He knew how to remain faithful while being pursued. He knew how to survive when the enemy refused to stop. And I found myself studying how David responded. One lesson hit me immediately. David would not touch Saul. Now, let's be honest. David had opportunities, real opportunities, opportunities to eliminate the problem, opportunities to end the pursuit, opportunities to defend himself. And yet, over and over again, David refused. Why? Because Saul was still the Lord's anointed. That lesson challenged me more than almost any other, because it forced me to confront my relationship with my parents, particularly my father. I had every reason to be angry. I had every reason to justify resentment. I had every reason to justify bitterness. And yet God kept bringing me back to the same commandment. Honor your father and your mother. Not because they are perfect, not because they never hurt you, not because they always get it right, but because God takes authority seriously. That was hard, very hard. Because honoring someone does not mean agreeing with everything they have done. It does not mean pretending the pain didn't happen. It does not mean excusing wrongdoing. It means refusing to allow bitterness to become your master. David taught me that. There were moments when I wanted justice, moments when I wanted answers, moments when I wanted accountability. But David's restraint forced me to ask a different question. Can I trust God with judgment? Can I trust God with vindication? Can I trust God to deal with what I cannot fix? That lesson was not easy. I still wrestled with it, but it changed how I prayed. As my understanding of spiritual warfare deepened, I also began studying other kings. Josiah fascinated me. Here was a king who inherited generations of corruption, generations of compromise, generations of idolatry. Yet he made decisions that broke agreement with darkness. Then I studied Asa, a king who was willing to confront corruption even within his own family. That challenged me, because I began realizing that family loyalty and spiritual obedience are not always the same thing. There are moments when you have to stand with God even when people around you refuse to. That realization changed how I approached prayer. I started praying differently. I started praying with authority. I started praying with intention. I started praying for separation from agreements that did not belong to God. I started praying against things that I believed had legal access into my life. I started asking God to establish His government over my life completely. And the warfare escalated. The dreams intensified. The pressure intensified. The resistance intensified. Sometimes I would ask myself, why? If I was getting closer to God, why was the battle becoming stronger? Then I remembered David. The closer David came to his assignment, the more resistance he faced. The resistance wasn't proof that God had abandoned him. The resistance was proof that the battle mattered. That realization changed my perspective. I stopped viewing warfare as evidence of failure. I began viewing it as evidence that territory was being contested. And when the pressure became unbearable, I learned something else. I learned the power of one name, Jesus. There were nights when all I could say was his name. Not a long prayer, not a sophisticated prayer, not a theological argument, just Jesus. And over again, I discovered something. He responds, there are people who will argue theology. There are people who will debate doctrine. There are people who will question testimonies. That's their choice. My experience was different. My experience was that Jesus responds. There were moments when the atmosphere would shift immediately. Moments when fear would leave. Moments when peace would return. Moments when I knew he had stepped into the situation. Not because someone told me, because I experienced it. But there were other moments when he seemed silent. And those moments taught me another lesson. Sometimes Jesus fights for you. Sometimes Jesus teaches you to fight with him. That distinction changed everything. Because there were seasons when God seemed to say, stand, pray, intercede, fight. Not with hatred, not with fear, not with panic, with faith. And so I learned to encourage myself. Just as David encouraged himself in the Lord, I learned to worship when I did not feel like worshiping. I learned to pray when I did not feel like praying. I learned to stand when I wanted to run. I learned to trust when I wanted to quit. And eventually, I came to a place where I made a decision, a covenant, really. I would not bow. No matter how intense the pressure became, no matter how fierce the battle became, no matter how exhausted I became, I would not bow. The story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego became real to me. Even if God does not deliver us the way we expect, he is still God. Even if the fire remains hot, he is still God. Even if the battle continues, he is still God. And I realized something. This was what David had been teaching me all along. Warfare is not about winning one battle. It is about remaining faithful through all of them. David taught me how to worship. David taught me how to pray. David taught me how to lead. But perhaps most importantly, David taught me how to fight. Not with bitterness, not with revenge, not with fear, but with faith. And in the middle of that warfare, I discovered that I was never actually fighting alone. Because every time I called on Jesus, he showed up. And that changed everything.